Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Weird and Wonderful World of Children, explained by scientists. This is brought to you by the Developmental and Educational Science Group from Goldsmith University and by Baby Brains, the bridge between parents and society. I am Dr. Sylvia Dalvid, and I am the scientific director of Baby Brains. And today, here with us is Emma Davies from Goldsmith University. Welcome, Emma, and thank you so much for giving us your time and your expertise to talk about something really exciting today. Oh, I have a feeling we are a little bit stuck. Can you hear me, Emma?
I can hear you.
Okay,
I can't see
excellent.
the slides.
Okay, I'm going to put them on now. Here
Cool.
they are. Yes. So, yeah, again, so we're going to talk about physical punishment of children, to smack or not to smack. And Emma Davies is an absolute expert on the topic. And we're going to see after the slide presentation a little bit how you came to it in your personal and professional life. But now over to you for a good piece of learning for us.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So we're going to talk a bit about physical punishment. And today I'm going to talk a bit about some of the psychological literature on the impact of smacking children. I'm going to talk a bit about a rights perspective on smacking children, and I'll come back to that a bit later in terms of child rights. A bit about the law in England, Wales and Scotland, but also internationally and where I'm not sure where people are based. So I'll give you a way of being able to look up exactly what the laws are wherever you may be based. And then hearing from you and responding to questions. And before I get started, I'm going to just give you a little anecdote from my children. So I have two children, both of them grown up now. And when my son was about 2, he was in nursery and I was doing my doctorate many, many years ago. And we went to the university nursery and I went to pick him up at lunchtime, as we always did, to go and have a break with him for an hour or so in the middle of the day. And when I got there, one of the nursery staff said to me, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but your son's been hit by another child." And there was no mark. Right? The kid, Ben didn't care one way or the other. He was playing away and he was fine. It had happened a few hours earlier or a couple of hours earlier. So I didn't really think much of it. He seemed fine. And I said, "Thank you for telling me." Of course they had to tell me, and we moved on. Ben was still playing with something. So I hung about in the nursery while he was finishing playing, and the parent of the child that had hit my son came through the door and was told a similar story as the story I had been told, and I was sitting to the side. I was eavesdropping. And Mum was embarrassed and felt awkward about that, as we do if it's our son or our child that has done the hitting. It's much easier to be the one that's hit. So she felt awkward, and you could see she felt a bit embarrassed, and I was kind of trying to look at the floor. She went straight up to her child, hit the child and said, "Never do that again. You know you're not allowed to do that." And it always stuck in my head. So firstly, even if we believe that hitting children is a good idea, which I think I'm going to show you probably isn't, but even if we believe it is, we certainly would know that if we do something 2 hours later for a 2-year-old child and this other kid was about 2, it really is going to be completely meaningless. So through my eyes, what happened in that process was that Mum actually, rather than taught the child that hitting children was not okay, what she actually did by her behavior was suggest that actually hitting children was a reasonably good idea, because it's exactly what she had just done. So what does the psychological literature say on this? Well, this comes from a meta-analysis by a woman called Elizabeth Gershoff, who's done a lot of work in this field over many, many years. And this is the most up-to-date meta-analysis. And by meta-analysis, I mean something that pulls together all of the literature that cuts across different ways of doing research. So this picks up some cross-sectional studies, so things that are done at one time, some longitudinal studies, so things that are done at different points in time, but it avoids she's taken out all of the stuff where people used implements in the way that they hit kids. And what we find is that it's associated with increased antisocial behavior, more externalizing and internalizing problems. So the externalizing are the acting out stuff, and the internalizing are the more withdrawn stuff. Later mental health problems, more negative relationships with parents, lower self-esteem, less moral internalization. If we think back to the example I just gave, the kid wasn't learning internally that that was not a good idea because of the reaction to the child. And that could only have been done actually in the context of that interaction. And weaker cognitive ability. There has been no relationships found between use of physical punishment and children's immediate acts of defiance or children's use of alcohol and drugs. The relationships don't appear to depend on how physical punishment is measured, who reports it, what type of study is used, or the age of the children. Spanking, and some people call it smacking, spanking, hitting children, can escalate into physical abuse, with many studies finding increased use increases the risks of physical abuse. Now, although that reference is a bit old now, I've put it up there because Murray Strauss, who is an academic in the Center for Violence Against Children at the University of New Hampshire in the States, has worked on this for probably 30 years. And so for those of you interested in this stuff, picking up work from Elizabeth Gershoff, who I've mentioned, or from Murray Strauss, you might find interesting. In essence, studies continue to find that spanking, or we could insert smacking, or we could insert hitting, predicts negative behavior changes. And perhaps of most importance, there are no studies showing that kids improve as a result of use of physical punishment. There are no studies showing that kids improve. So having shown, I hope, that the literature is reasonably clear on this, now the impact of exactly to what extent hitting children leads to X or Y differs by study. But the idea of it having a negative impact doesn't differ by study or how it's done. So the research is reasonably clear now. So there's something else going on in terms of why we might still do it. So do children have the same rights to legal protection from violence as adults? And for some people, that's a sort of odd question, because of course children don't have the same sort of rights as adults, or do they? So let's have a think about it in terms of women first, because sometimes that's an easier frame to have a think about it. In 1857, so ages ago, there was a rule of thumb in the United Kingdom that it was lawful for a man to hit his wife, providing that the stick he used was no thicker than his thumb. Now that sounds ridiculous to us, I suggest to you today. A couple of years later, the law of coverture. Once married, husbands are legally responsible for the actions of their wife and children. Therefore, husbands can physically and verbally chastise them to control their behavior. Few of us, I suggest, around this table, if any of us, would think that that was acceptable. We'd all, at this point in the evolution of things, think that was unacceptable. But now let's change the words just a bit. We'll delete the once married, and we'll just substitute husbands for parents. So parents are legally responsible for the actions of their children. Therefore, parents can physically and verbally chastise them to control their behavior. Now, at this point in our development as nations, that doesn't sound as weird as it does when we're thinking about it in terms of men towards women. And I've thrown the last one in because it always makes me smile. 1895, wife beating is prohibited between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. so that the noise doesn't keep the neighbours awake. Well, it's important that we get our priorities straight. So that 1861, though, is quite interesting. So I'm going to just repeat that bit again. So parents are legally responsible for the actions of their children. Therefore, parents can physically and verbally chastise them to control their behavior. And for some of us, that is not odd. Now, the children's rights movement actually has fallen from the back of the women's movement and is much newer. Many countries in the world have signed the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. 196 countries, in fact, have signed this convention. The only country with a democratically elected government that has not signed this convention is the United States of America, because they don't sign these kinds of conventions. With an exception, every country with a democratically elected government has signed the UNCRC, or in its full terms, United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, when each country signs this, they have to report to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child every 5 years. There is a report that goes from the government, and there is generally a report that goes from community organisations, non-government organisations, which often give a slightly different view than the formal government view. All that gets reported to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, and then the committee produces a report on every country every 5 years. And you can look this up, should you so choose, on your country as to what reports have gone in and what the committee said. Now, broadly speaking, there are 54 articles, and they kind of go into 3 different categories. Participation, so children's right to participate in community life. Protection, children's rights to be protected from a range of different things, including violence. And provision, so states' obligations to provide services that focus on children and their families. And as I say, there are 54 articles that, broadly speaking, come into those 3 categories. Article 19 is probably the one that is of most relevance here. States parties, so that's governments, take all appropriate legislative, so the ability to produce law, administrative, social and educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence, injury or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment or exploitation, including sexual abuse, while in the care of parents, legal guardians, or any other person responsible for the child. There are other articles in there that apply to this too, but that's probably the clearest. So I'm now going to go through a bit about what happens in the United Kingdom, and we've got 3 countries in the United Kingdom here in terms of the law: Wales, Scotland, and England and Northern Ireland. So in terms of the children in Scotland, there is something that has just recently been introduced. So 2019 came into force in 2020, so a couple of years ago, which removed the defence of reasonable chastisement for the physical assault of children. Now, that Scottish law came into force on November the 7th in 2020. Now, Scotland was a long way from the first in the world to do this. France did something similar in 2020. The first country in the world to do this was actually Sweden. In 1957 was when they started this process as to removing the rights of parents to hit children. Sweden has had an ombudsman for children longer than anybody else and has had a focus on children's rights. It's probably the birth of the child rights field was in Sweden. In New Zealand, where I've lived and I'm a joint citizen, we were the first country in the world to remove the rights of parents to use discipline for the purposes of correction in 2007. In 2020, Scotland became the 58th country to give children the same legal rights under the law as adults, and then Wales followed their lead on the 21st of March 2022, so about a year ago. England, however, still allows parents to hit children, so long as it is reasonable punishment. And that tends to get defined by not leaving a mark or using some sort of object or implement. But at this stage, England has not chosen to remove the rights of parents to use that reasonable punishment. And that debate in England is not very live, as far as I can see. There are certainly some people, of course, that are engaged in this discussion, but overall, that debate is nowhere near as alive as it is in Scotland and in Wales. Now, I don't know if this is going to work on this system, so we'll see. No. Okay, there is what we might be able to do is put this wee video up for people to be able to see. It's come from the Welsh Government. And the reason I've put it here, and it is available online, the reason I've put it here is that it gives a nice example of how this works. So when countries make the decision to do this, what they tend to do is put quite a long lead-in time. So in Wales, they put a lead-in time of about 18 months. And in that 18 months, they did a whole heap of parenting education about other forms of processes to discipline children. So nobody is suggesting in this that as parents, we don't have obligations to discipline our children at times. There is a big difference, however, between use of different forms of discipline and physical punishment. There are better ways to correct behavior than to use physical punishment. So they go through this process and explain how they're doing it and what exactly they're going to do, and then how that legislation is monitored. In New Zealand, we did something very similar. We had a longer lead-in time. We had 2 years, 2.5 years as a lead-in time, with a very big parenting campaign done on lots of levels, at community level, and also with big kind of public information campaigns and such like, before the law was introduced, and then monitored its impact. Nobody was trying, and indeed, as far as I'm aware, in none of the countries that I'm aware of the process that's happened, has this in any way criminalized parents. That was never its intention. Its intention is to shift attitude so that we get the best possible parenting of our children. Now, here's some objections that were raised in New Zealand, and I was very heavily involved in this for many years. So often when people were raising objections, they came into these kind of 4 categories, really. 1, never did me any harm. When I was hit as a kid, and I'm going to pass that on, and I'm all right. So why shouldn't I do it to my kids, and it's quicker and easier? So the idea of it never did me any harm. And these days, if we look at it in terms of our scientific research, it indicates that while one smack is not going to cause irreversible damage, please don't get me wrong, what we do know from research is that the physical punishment of children actually does hold risks of harm and doesn't have any potential positive benefit for children, or indeed for parents. A stronger one that came up were religious and cultural beliefs, where some people believed that, and there's a range of different religions that this falls into, but I'm going to use Christianity as an example, that spare the rod, spoil the child. It says so in the Bible. We have to do it, and that is in the child's best interests. So I'm going to put science into the picture again here to suggest that actually what we know from scientific evidence is that that's not true. But I'm also going to put in one of the Bishop of Auckland views on this. He's the Archbishop of Auckland, and we had long conversations about this at the time with various religious leaders. And his response to me was, no, people misunderstand it. Spare the rod, spoil the child. The rod is a guide. The rod is not something to hit people with. The rod is a guide. So in other words, if you don't guide your children, then you spoil your children. But it is not about use of physical punishment. Now, I'm sure many of us could have discussions about whether or not we think that that's right, but that was certainly his interpretation of the Bible as the Archbishop of Auckland. And then there were some concerns that the state, so the government, doesn't have the right to interfere in family life. What I do with my kids is my business and nothing to do with anybody else. And that tended to get into a political discussion, which got very heated in New Zealand. Indeed, to the extent that at one point, quite late on in the process of changing the law, there were marches in Auckland where parents were marching in the streets for the right to hit their children. Now, by the time we had marches in the street of people marching, demonstrating for the right to hit their children, from where we sat, the argument, in inverted commas, had been won because it looked ridiculous. And the vast majority of the population by that point were quite comfortable with the change in law. So this was a small minority, but it was a loud and vocal minority that would probably sit, if I was in America, we were in New Zealand, but in terms of their political frame on the world, it would probably sit very near to the kind of moral majority evangelical Christians in the United States of America, which in New Zealand is quite a small group. And then the fourth kind of main reason why people didn't think this was a good idea, or the objections that would come forward, were about the fears that struggling parents will be treated as criminals. And we've all been in supermarkets. Let me talk for myself. I've been in supermarket where I've got two children, and one of them decides that it's a really good idea to do something that we really don't want them to do. And it all becomes embarrassing and awkward. And we've got another kid that's kind of wanting to get out of the shop, and we really don't handle and manage this situation badly. Well, so we've all kind of been there where we're struggling. And then if at that moment in time we were to hit the child, which as it so happens I didn't do, but I could certainly understand why somebody would, out of irritation and frustration more than anything else, we would, and then a policeman happened to be there buying his lunch, would that mean that we would end up in jail? And the answer was no. The answer was a very crystal clear no. This was never the intention of the legislation and was not something that increased in terms of criminalizing of parents. That said, what it did stop in New Zealand, and I was involved in a court case, for example, with some young women with some kids who had been beaten with a birch. So lots of sticks tied together, and there was a long thing, and these were kids that were brought up in a very religious community, and the prosecution had taken the parents to court. These kids were quite badly bruised from repeated use of this birch of physical punishment. And the parents believed, mum in particular, had a very strong belief in God and believed that she was beating the devil out of them. And she genuinely believed that she was beating the devil out of them. And that this was something that was in their interests. They were taken to court, and prior to that law, it took the jury, given her intent, despite the bruises, they felt sorry for mum, who believed she was doing the right thing. And it took a jury 2.5 minutes to find her not guilty of physical abuse of that child, of those children. After the law, that would not have been plausible. So where things like that happened, and indeed in New Zealand, there were a number of court cases that I was involved in some way or another, where that would have been acceptable. And I suspect to most of us around this table, that would be over the line, and we'd see that as physical abuse. For those of us who have very strong religious beliefs, fundamentalist religious beliefs, not just in terms of Christianity, I'm secular, but I can use my own religion in terms of Judaism, where quite recently there has been some cases in the UK where Some ultra orthodox schools have been using the cane and physical punishment, despite it actually being unlawful. So these things sometimes are done in the name of religion. It then becomes a question about whether our secular states will stand up for the rights of the child. So it gets into not only a scientific argument, but a rights argument. For those of you, I am making the assumption, probably wrongly, in terms of where people are. So endcorporalpunishment.org will give you all the information about the specifics of legislation in any given country. This is 2019. We now know there's another couple of countries that have removed those rights. 3 countries that I'm aware of, France 2020, Wales and Scotland. So in conclusion, there is no evidence that physical punishment is a good parenting tool. There is evidence, solid scientific evidence, coming from both cross-sectional, so at one given point in time, and longitudinal, so at different points in time, that it can be harmful. Those wanting to look that stuff up, Elizabeth Gershoff is probably your best bet, Gershoff. That's an open access meta-analysis, so it gives you a summary of all of it. In my view, children should have the same legal rights to protection from violence as adults. It's not just my view, but that of the United Nations, and sits within the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And for those of us in Europe, there is a European Convention that mirrors that through the European Commission. In my view, adults also have a right to parenting education to enable us. We all want to do the best we can for our kids, including the woman that I was talking about earlier on, who used a birch to beat her children in the name of God. She meant well, she intended good for her children. She believed that it was in her child's best interests. We have a right to parenting education. And laws that are introduced tend to be preceded by parenting education, designed to reduce the use of physical punishment and improve the parenting of the nation's children. They are not designed to criminalize parents who give their child an odd smack out of frustration. And with that, I will thank you and look forward to questions, comments, as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's such a charged, heavy topic, and so important, and especially because you really, put the spotlight on that at probably people that still think smacking or spanking or hitting is a good idea. And it can come from a real, genuine desire to do what's good for the child. And so this is where science is in a very unique position to bring information without any sort of agenda behind it. It's just like, this is what we could find, and so maybe we can work with that and look at what seems to actually factually be in the interest of the child or not. So in the last few weeks, we've collected a few questions about this topic, also collecting from the parents that follow us. And if anyone is listening now and wants to pop a question, you're most welcome to do so in the comments, and I will then read them out loud. But why don't we start with, you mentioned you were involved with different laws and different progress in New Zealand. So can you tell us a little bit about your personal story there?
Yeah, so I was principal advisor to New Zealand's Children's Commissioner. And before that, I was working with non-government organisations, Bernardo, Save the Children, those kinds of organisations, doing a range of stuff to do with child rights. My interest in this field actually started earlier than that, in about 2000, when I heard somebody called Bruce Perry speak. And Bruce was doing some work on was a child psychologist, child psychiatrist, and a neurobiologist. And his talk was around child protection and different ways of conceptualizing child protection. So I had been doing a lot of work in child protection and domestic violence of one form or another, and research and policy in that space. And I've been thinking about it all in terms of service provision, and how do we, once something has happened, how do we ameliorate the consequences of those major problems? So not physical punishment, but major issues for kids in terms of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. And one of the things that was an aha moment for me in listening to him and in doing lots of reading and stuff on books like From Neurons to Neighborhoods, which was another one of those aha moments for me by a guy called Jim Shonkoff, what that did was suggest to me, we're thinking about this all wrong. If we're thinking about it all at what public health professionals will call the tertiary end of the system, so all about what we do with our services when things go wrong, we are missing a big trick here. What we need to be doing is thinking about what is it that enables human flourishing and what gets in the way and at what stage in the lifespan. And so I through that journey, became particularly interested in how do we prevent these kinds of things from happening. And that got me into thinking about, well, what do we need to do with the whole community? What do we need to target with some people who might be struggling? And then the services and the stuff where things have gone really badly wrong, then we can deal with that too. But if we don't get that first two bits right, then we ain't going anywhere really with the third bit. So it was a change in thinking for me that happened for me nearly 25 years ago.
Yeah, that's incredible. And it's it's where we are at as well as baby brains. The idea is really to, we prevent, not only prevent bad things from happening, but really to empower good things, so that that we fulfill the potential of ourselves as parents, that the children get an environment where they can actually be themselves and feel better for themselves and contribute to society as well. This means educating the whole population. It's not just a thing that concerns parents, not even just families. It concerns every single citizen. So yeah, thank you for your work.
And to add to that, the part of human development that science tells us is most critical is the part in those very, very first through pregnancy and the first couple of years of life. When I worked in the Ministry of Social Development in New Zealand, again, many years ago, we had a slogan that we used, which was early in the life of the child and early in the life of the problem. And that importance of getting in very early. And of course, when we're thinking about physical punishment, taking it back to this topic for a second, the majority of physical punishment of children happens at that point early in the lifespan, not later. That's where the majority of physical punishment is used.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, you were saying before that physical punishment and physical abuse are then quite linked. So in a way, I'm just I don't know the data, but I'm imagining that if you start smacking your child when they one to teach them not to touch the plugs, you kind of pass that barrier where you actually begin using physical violence to do something good, and then it just has to increase because we know that punishment and reward, by the way, they just need to increase in order to produce the same effect. And so you're kind of opening the door to a lot of
that's right. And also that's right. And also the norm changes in what we see as is or isn't acceptable. So there's a shift in the norm as well, I think, that can happen. The plug one is often used. It's funny you should use that one as an example. That one's often used, the whole, but if a child puts the finger in the socket, then they're going to get an electric shock. I don't know about you, but I've never needed to hit a child to pick them up and remove them from the socket, right? So it's not like this space and this physical punishment does not mean that we can't touch our kids, and it doesn't mean that we can't give them cuddles, and it doesn't mean that we can't remove them from dangerous situations. What we shouldn't do, if we listen to the science, is hit them. But use the plug one. If I want to stop a child from putting their finger in the socket, I am going to, because it's the little kids that are going to do that, I'm going to pick that child up and I'm going to put them somewhere else, and to prevent that from happening. And at the same time, I'm going to use those things, that you can put in that prevents them putting the things in the socket. So we can also change our environments to prevent us to need to do that. But the socket one is often used. And
Yes.
so I just
Yeah,
want
we hear it often from our parents as well, because it's that one and crossing the road when a car is coming. These are the two ones where we all agree we need to do something, right? We don't want the child to, like, they're a good example to show us something needs to be done. And I guess everybody, as you were saying before, everybody agrees that children need parents to discipline them, to help them around the world. They are not able to cope by themselves. And what you were saying before, what you were showing before, is that there are things that work well in protecting the child from the plug. I removed the child, I protected the child perfectly. I smacked the child, apart from the fact that it might harm the child, it probably does. It's not helping them to not
to learn.
to learn to not put the fingers in the plug. So
That's right. Not one study that I have read determines physical punishment to be helpful.
yeah,
So it doesn't work.
yeah. And I think parents need to hear this loud and clear. Sometimes you're frustrated, and sometimes we don't have a better idea. And
Yep.
okay, we've always been there, as you were saying.
Yep.
But rationally, we know it doesn't work. So having that idea is equal to having zero ideas because it just doesn't work. Yeah.
I also don't think we should beat ourselves up if occasionally we do it because we're angry. And I mean, I can think of a time when my daughter, who's now 35, she must have been about 6 months, and she would not go to sleep, and I was exhausted, and it was the middle of the night. And I remember, and I can still picture it really strongly, I moved her too harshly to put her into the cot. It wasn't a gentle move. It was abusive, no, but it was harsher than I would be proud of. It still stays in my head, but I don't really beat myself up about it. We get frustrated, we get cross. Occasionally, we're human. But using it as a strategy is a mistake.
Yeah. Thank you for saying it so clearly. And kind of related to this is, in your experience and research, have you found that there still is a taboo around it? What I mean is that are there people that maybe do use smacking and hitting, but don't admit to it, and they kind of, or do you find that people tend to, in a way, like these people in the streets, like they kind of, it's part of almost their identity that they do it. You see what I mean?
I think it's both, Anne. So I mean, a lot of stuff in this space relies on self-report, right? So you ask a certain question. So Murray Strauss, one of the people I've mentioned earlier, has developed something that's a sort of reliable, standardized scale called the conflict tactics scale that's often gets used. It's reliable. We know that when we use it one place, it's probably going to be the same as another. It's valid. We know it's measuring what we think it's measuring. Lost it now. So it's self-report. Do people lie in self-report? Yeah, I'm sure they do. The key is whether, through my eyes, the cultural norms are shifting. Is it more acceptable to hit children now than it was in my parents' generation? And I would argue that things have changed quite a lot, particularly in the West. I'd argue that it was much more acceptable for my parents to hit children than it would be for me to hit children. And indeed, when my children have children, it'll be less acceptable, or at least I say when. They haven't argued that that's a good idea yet. That's a hope. So when I become a grandparent, my greatest dream in the world, I suspect that the notion of parents hitting children will be far less. I remember when we were talking with the Swedish ombudsman about some of this stuff before starting this work in New Zealand, one of the kind of She turned around at one point and said, looked as if, oh, so you still eat people, as in you still hit children. Like it was just not part of the cultural norm. And that, I think, is where many countries are moving towards, and we are seeing less and less of it. In the secular world. Now, there are also some different cultural communities and different religious communities that do see it as a positive part of parenting. In my opinion, culture can be wrong. And indeed, the fact that 197 countries have signed the United Nations Convention on the Child, which makes it very clear that physical punishment of children is not acceptable and always criticizes governments that still have it on the books, suggests that that cultural dimension is not quite as strong as some individuals and families and communities may believe it is. Where it becomes a part of religious identity, and I go back to the example I gave with the woman who it took a jury only a few moments to find her not guilty, despite using a birch. And the reason for that is that she genuinely believed she was beating the devil out of them. She genuinely believed that this is within their interests. That's much harder to argue with. So I can provide all the scientific evidence in the world to suggest that this is not a good idea and not in the interests of the child. And at the end of the day, if this is a very strong religious or cultural belief, that scientific evidence is not going to make any difference. And so that becomes another frame of a shift in culture that happens over time. So we did have religious leaders of all main denominations that were supportive of the change in the law. But there were also plenty of religious leaders that were not. That gets into a slightly more complex debate. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's and both. I think for some, where it's, oh, I've minimized it a bit and I'm lying, that's easier to change. Where it's a firmly held identity that sits very firmly, particularly within some dimension of religiosity, that's harder to shift.
Yeah. Yes.
It's a belief system.
I have one more question and then I will let you go. You've really been very generous with your time. But you were mentioning, you kind of gave us this, I didn't know where rule of thumb came from. And thank you. And you show us what happened with women. Mm-hmm. And now we find it just almost ridiculous, right? And in a way, however, as you demonstrated really well, we're kind of applying a similar logic sometimes to children. And so it seems that somehow dehumanizing people and hitting them goes together. So what's the cause and what's the effect there? Like, do we see people are not as human as us, and so hence we can hit them? Or is it the fact of hitting them that somehow creates that distance? What do you think?
Through my eyes, this gets into our attitudes towards children. There's some sayings in English like children should be seen and not heard. Mm-hmm. Kind of in English culture, it kind of goes back to Victorian England and in different ways of framing up how we see children. There is a shift in thinking about children as autonomous beings. So I will still talk about my children, even though they're adults, as my children. And I still feel parental responsibility for my children, but I don't construct it, and actually never did, that I own those children. My job is to guide, my job is to support, my job is to sometimes get it wrong. My job is an authentic relationship with my children, and the strategies I'll use will, on a good day and on most days, are based on the best available evidence about what I'll choose to do. But they're not but I don't own my children. That's a shift in thinking for some of us. Just as men owned women, so us as parents, and indeed it's very much part of our language, as part of the English language, that these are my kids. And it's a shift in frame and a shift in attitude, and the fact that the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child happened at all, bearing in mind that it was really only 1989 it was developed, so that might seem a long time ago for some, but actually it's not that long, really, not in the scheme of history, that we're really only now starting to talk about, well, what does this mean in terms of children's rights? So for me, the answer to your question lies in those broader attitudes towards ownership of children and the way that we construct childhood, and our role in relation to that as parents in the development of healthy, flourishing childhoods. So I think there's a shift that way. And for people that are interested in that, Google's so magnificent these days. We can pick up things like there's some really interesting work on the sociology of childhood. So that gets it out of psychology and into the realms of another discipline. But there's some really quite interesting work done on the sociology of childhood. It's a guy called Patton, whose first name escapes me in Britain, but there are plenty of others. If you just Google sociology of childhood and you're interested in kind of that kind of thinking, you might find some of that stuff quite interesting.
Dr. Emma Davies, thank you so much. I think you've given us such an informative and inspirational talk today. We will have food for thought for a while. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And we look forward to maybe having you here again one day.
It's lovely to meet you. Thank you. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.